from my vacation back home, so I'm technically still on vacation. But I will get the meeting started. I have pretty decent signal, but Dave Winokur will be running the majority of the call today once we get the formalities out of the way. So Celeste, if you would, roll call and the establishment of a quorum.
Thank you all for attending the Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group being held on July 5th, 2023 at 1 p.m. I will now open this meeting with some information for the work group. The Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group will be following the open meeting requirements of Bagley-Keene. If you would like to speak, please raise your hands. Members of the public can comment on an agenda following member discussion, but we ask that you limit your time for the items not on the agenda. The public will have an opportunity to address the group, but you are asked to limit your comments to 3 minutes. If you are filling in for a committee member, please answer for the person you are filling in for and state your first and last name. I will now take roll call. Jim McDougall.
Here.
Carlos Camarena. Deborah Hobblestadt.
Esteban Mendoza on behalf of Deborah Haberstadt and the Department of Insurance.
Thank you, Esteban. Neil Machuca. Paul Glushko. Max Mortiz.
Here.
Thank you. Nancy Watkins.
Here.
Dave Winokur. I see Dave.
Sorry, I'm here. Didn't realize I was muted.
Thank you. Robert Marshall.
I'm here.
Anthony Powers. Yana Valachovic.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Chris Ochoa.
I'm here, and I have Nick Camerata joining me as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dory Beats.
Here.
Carrie Woodrow.
Here.
Joe Irvin. And Melissa Sempser. We have 10 people. Quorum is 9 people. 50 plus 1 quorum is established. We will now move on to agenda review, and a motion will be required to adopt an agenda.
Okay, thank you, Celeste. Again, this is all virtual, so for those of you that make a motion or a second to motion, please state your name. So is there a motion to adopt the agenda?
Nancy Watkins.
Robert Marshall, motion to adopt.
Nancy
I
Watkins.
beat you, Nancy.
Yeah, I know. I'll second you, Robert.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been first and seconded. All those in favor of adopting the agenda signify by aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries unanimously. Approval of last meeting agenda minutes. A motion to approve.
Nancy Watkins, so moved.
Is there a second?
Robert Marshall, second.
Thank you, Robert. Is there a second? Any discussion? Okay, not seeing any hands. All those in favor of approving the last meeting minutes signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Hope you all had a chance. I know it's been a kind of a crazy week with 4th of July on a Tuesday, but to review the documentation that Celeste sent out. And with that, I will turn it over to Dave to start the discussion.
All right. Thanks, Jim. So for the broader group, Deborah and Melissa and I met to try to take what was becoming a pretty confused draft with a lot of markups and to try to distill that down. For the broader group, there were a couple elements that I think are required that we have a discussion and achieve alignment around what it is, well, really how we want to approach the issue. The primary one, which is where you see not all of, but a significant element, at least from a volume standpoint, of the changes to the previous Word document, had to do with the inclusion of catastrophe models and the output of them that's associated with the pricing of potential loss through either average annual loss or the EPL. There's really been, to summarize, and I certainly would invite those whose positions I'm attempting to summarize to speak for themselves on this in a moment. But I think there's tension between the idea that the pricing of loss, so not just the probability of it occurring, but translating that probability into an average annual loss, which is a catastrophe model output that involves putting dollars and cents against the potential loss, whether that is inside or outside the scope of the report, and whether or not it is appropriate for this group to review that. I think to generally summarize, on one hand, that can very quickly move into a discussion of rate setting and insurance regulation, which I believe we all are in agreement is outside the scope of what this work group is trying to do. On the other side, that can be used, the potential reduction in loss measured in dollars and cents can be used to quantify the value of mitigations, as in it costs X amount to conduct and maintain these mitigations that obviously a risk model could help feed via the work being done in parallel by the mitigations task force. On the other hand, if we don't know what it costs, right, then how do we figure out the cost to benefit while staying out of the discussion of the regulatory scheme around which insurance is regulated, which I think is appropriately CDI's realm, not the realm of a CAL FIRE work group, which we are here now. So that's the greatest unresolved issue that I think as a broader group we need to discuss and need to have a good understanding of what the pros and cons are, because there's a significant amount of edits to either accept or deny that'll largely fall on what's the appropriate scope. Deborah, understanding that I cannot claim to speak for your position for CDI, I would like to give you a chance to express concerns CDI may have or you may have about the inclusion of CAT models and which parts of the inclusion of CAT models would be problematic from your perspective.
This is Esteban Mendoza on behalf of Deborah. I think, given that I was not a participant in that prior discussion, and I do not have access to the document except to what's on view here in the shared document, I think I see that Deborah has made comments. So perhaps if we want to go over specific comments that Deborah made and read those out loud, then that can elucidate a little bit what's the discussion. Again, I just have not had the privilege of having access to this document or being part of that process.
Okay. Give me a second to pull those comments up.
And just before other comments come up here, I believe in other public meetings there was discussions, and again, I don't know if it would help to reread the points that created this work group and the exact questions it's supposed to answer, and whether reading that will help. I believe there was also discussion that it is sufficient to discuss the percentage of damage or the amount of damage as that's being sufficient for the purposes of what this work group was required to do without getting into specific rates or specific pricing. I believe that was some of the prior comments as well.
Okay, so
Hey, Dave, before we take off here,
Yep.
how would you like me to handle this? Would you like me to do the notes for you? Would you like to do them yourself? How would you like that to happen?
Oh, if you can keep notes, that would be amazing. My
Yeah.
ability to.
So I don't know if we want to go through it. I've got it up on the screen. I don't know if we want to go through it that way and then I can add stuff in for you guys, or I mean, how would we?
Yeah,
Or I can
don't think
record
we're
it and
ready
add
to
it
start.
later.
Yeah, I don't think we're ready to start keystroking just yet, Celeste, because there is I think there's a need to have the discussion and resolve it. Yana, while I'm pulling up the notes or the comments from the previous document, anything you'd like to add would be helpful?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who worked on the document and got us to this point. It's feeling better. A couple of questions is for process for today. I was a little confused about whether we were invited to edit, and it didn't look like I was capable of being able to edit. So curious about what your thoughts are there. And then are we going to have time today to talk about what might be some of the key ideas within the executive summary, which is not inserted yet, to make sure that we're in agreement around sort of the overall mission? I think that in my mind, those things might help flow into this question around how do we, work on this CAT model piece. Some of the bigger conclusions might be helpful to help flow this conversation together.
Well, I agree on the bigger. I was approaching it from the opposite side, which was from the having been involved in the editing. The thing we kept coming back on not being able to move forward on was, should CAT models be in or should CAT models be out? And then there's a big section of the exec summary, and there's a big section down in the barriers and recommendations that revolve around that question. And so that one felt like if we could get to, and there's clearly not consensus right now. And so having a better understanding by the broader group, obviously a group of 3, I was not comfortable that we could speak for the full group on this. So if, from my perspective, if we could resolve that one first, then we could get to the broader, to your point about what are the points what is the format in which we're going to use, and what are the points we're trying to relay in the executive summary, understanding that most readers won't make it beyond the executive summary. So that it's really important that we use that valuable real estate properly.
Right. I mean, it's still, I guess overall, it still feels a little bit dense and jargony in places. And, we're in this in a deeper way than the average reader will be. So being thoughtful about how we make the language accessible and interpretable.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I guess to put a finer point on it, the challenge we were having was we were, without having resolved the big issue, the big question of CAT models, which seems to be the one that we're farthest apart from consensus on, that it was going to be difficult to get into making everything else more accessible.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the comments, Celeste, if you could scroll down, there were several specific comments that were left in from Deborah with regard to concerns around the what is the scope of the work group, and what is the manner in which we draw the line. There was a specific reference to an element of the scope, which was, I'll note, was derived by this work group. The scope was something we came up with, and part of that scope was that we were not going to consider the economic impacts of wildfire loss. And my memory of what we wrote at the time, and what my interpretation of how it's written suggests that economic impacts was limited to a discussion of things like business continuity and disruption of economies, not the financial cost measured in dollars and cents of a direct wildfire loss. So the question really, I think, for the broader group, and trying to summarize the position Deborah had, was that where is the line between things that are relevant to a model's output, that is an average annual loss or a cost of the things that are burned, the value of the things that are potentially burned, versus the probability of wildfire just reaching a community, yes, no, or a number of structures without dollars and cents next to it. I think that's the best I can summarize, and the specific concern about some sections that have been deleted, and I don't think are a topic of further discussion, is whether or not a discussion of the rate setting formulas and regulation around rate setting, whether that should be included. That, I believe, has been stricken from the initial draft of the report, and I don't think there's a whole lot of conversation around that. But somewhere between rate setting and just probability of fire is a middle ground, which is the probability of fire and the potential cost that fire can impose as far as the value of things that are burned. That is the best summary I think I can provide of what Deborah's position was, and the question was whether or not those were in the scope or out of the scope. I went back and looked at what the legislator directed, and it says very little about what is in the scope, what's out of the scope. And so I think it's worth remembering that the language that we have included in scope that we've discussed, that was language this group came up with. And this group's sense of where we would, like, we weren't going to consider things like disruption and continuity business caused by smoke effects somewhere else, and that we were going to focus on the physical manifestations of fire. With that, I can't tell who's got their hand raised.
Nancy's number one right now, and then that'll be followed by Max.
All right, Nancy, would you give you the floor?
Sure. Thank you for calling on me. Just a few things. The first I heard about the prohibition on the use of the term catastrophe models and the idea that we would not be using any models that produce dollar outputs, and we'd be prohibited from speaking about these in the draft, was when we got the CDI comments on this big draft here. I went back and I looked at minutes from our prior meeting to try to see if there was a divergence. Like my understanding all along was that we were going to talk extensively about different kinds of models, including catastrophe models, and how they could be used to inform mitigation efforts, and that was consistent with the legislature. So I have pulled up minutes from a few prior meetings. I can see that our minutes from January 23rd, which was a meeting that Esteban Mendoza attended in lieu of Deborah Halberstadt. There's a specific reference in the minutes, understanding what actual models can do and where they are right now. Know that this model in the paper is to be a CAP model, expectation of outputs in the model. That was just one reference in one set of meeting notes. We had Matt Chamberlain presenting 2 different times on a bunch of different kinds of models. There was one called catastrophic risk models. We went into lots and lots of details about hazard scores, maps, and CAP models. We had CoreLogic present about their wildfire mitigation scores and their catastrophe models. We've had multiple papers passed around that Jim McDougald asked me to send, which were about, they're the same papers that are referenced in the draft doc that was originally presented to the group, about like the CAS study on mitigation that was focused on Arinda Moraga. Some of the things that CDI has stricken and said that they're out of scope. So to me, like, we've been talking all along about catastrophe models informing mitigation. And I agree that we shouldn't get into insurance pricing, and I believe that it is very, very doable to get rid of even extended discussions on availability and affordability, because those aren't directly mitigation. And I actually have gone through the paper and made a version of that does that. But deleting references to CAP models is clearly not what we had envisioned when we voted on the outline that had tons and tons of references to to CAP models. The one place where that Deborah's comments point to financial being out of scope, it references something that I wrote in the doc, which it wasn't intended to mean financial outputs are out of scope. It meant that economic outputs are out of scope, like doing a bunch of economic modeling of, businesses failing and what that means to future economy. So the one place that she's pointing to as this is something the group agreed to, it's something I wrote, and it was not what I meant at all. So I'm happy to reword that part of it, but I don't believe that we've ever, as a group, had this conversation before. And I'm very concerned that a lot of the information that was put together exactly to do the charge we were supposed to fulfill has been excised, and I don't understand why. I mean, the reason that it's out of scope to me is not clear from the legislation. Even if it were, which I don't think is true, what's the harm of putting a bunch of good information about CAP models and studies that they've been used to inform mitigation measurements? Why is it so bad to have a model that outputs dollars and that can be used for mitigation cost benefit analysis? If we're not talking about insurance pricing, what exactly is the CDI's objection? I don't understand that.
Do we want to go to Max and then to Esteban? Yes, Max, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I kind of lean towards Nancy's perspective on a lot of what she just commented on. My only thought was that as far as a workaround to avoid the financial aspects of the conversation, how much losses end up costing. In order to make an estimate like that, you need a likelihood of the hazard and the number of homes exposed, and then the likelihood of ignition, right? And it seems like because mitigations can occur on the reducing the hazard side or reducing the home ignition vulnerability side, those are both important to have in the conversation and in the equation. But that's all you need, though, to estimate a loss. You can still back away from actually quantifying the financial impact of the loss. You could estimate how much a certain mitigation activity costs, and then how much benefit it results in the reduction of the probability of a home loss without attaching a dollar value to the home loss itself. So it seems like we could still do everything Nancy was talking about with CAP models and so on without actually putting a dollar value on the home loss.
But why?
That I can't answer. I don't understand, Nancy, either why we wouldn't. I'm saying there is a workaround if we need it, I think.
Why would you take models that give you? I'm not even sure how you would figure out structural damage to a house. I'm not exactly sure what model output you would use to look at percentage reduction if you weren't looking at dollars. So I know how to do it if you are looking at dollars. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't understand why. If we're not talking about insurance pricing, what is the reason for not talking about dollars? Why do communities not care about dollars? Why does CAL FIRE not care about dollars? Why do legislators not care about dollars? When they're talking about reducing risk, who says dollars are not important?
Esteban, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'll try to be very concise and thanks. The discussion is going all over the place. I think let's keep two perspectives in mind. First of all, Nancy, I appreciate your comments. I do hope we try to be very accurate about things. Obviously, a calculation of financial losses cannot happen if you first derive a percentage of harm. So there's obviously a damage function that's involved before you get to the actual money. A model doesn't first say, like even a CAP model doesn't first say, there will be $100 million in damages. Oh yeah, and 20% of destruction. It's the other way around. So a little bit of honesty on that would really help move this discussion forward. I think the other point that that Nancy, you made, I think is also very relevant to this. Nancy, right now, you just mentioned that the group has not had a discussion on financial losses. So I guess I would ask, because I was present in most of the public meetings, when 90% of those public meetings focus on the physical aspects of modeling, why is there such a huge change in this document to then focus on financial when the group itself, yes, that people here and there made one or two comments about financial impacts, the vast majority, 90% of the discussion was on physical aspects. So why is this report now trying to shift wholly to financial when all of the discussions was primarily focused on the physical? I think I will reserve any comments until perhaps those points can be addressed.
I may just jump in to clarify, Esteban. When you say the report is wholly on financial, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here other than financial. What's the basis of that statement?
Well, it seems like a lot of these discussions about all of this financial things are implying that, you know, that including all of these discussions is important. All I'm saying is, if the group did not set out specific experts and meetings and things to discuss whether financial losses was in and out of scope, is this the appropriate moment to be making those decisions? I mean, especially when we haven't had those discussions. Again, if the focus in all of the meetings before this were primarily focused on the physical harms, which tie into the objectives stated in the charter, shouldn't this report match that?
I mean, that's the point of us gathering today, is to ensure the report faithfully represents the results of all of our discussion and our work, some of which included pricing of risk through CAP models, some of which included mitigation, some of which included essentially the underpinnings of how models work, and distilling down which are the relevant elements and in what manner they're included in the report. That's the purpose of this gathering, to ensure that all of us, and there's a lot of folks involved, that everyone is comfortable with what we're doing. I, for one, having spent a lot of time working on the language that we're using, it's extremely challenging to ensure that we're accurately reflecting everything that everyone thought over the number of meetings we've had. So, at least from my perspective, yes, this is the right place to do that, since we have all the players here, and we have a document that we have to resolve and we owe as an output. Yana, you got your hand up?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this conversation. At some level, I feel like maybe we're getting a little too deep in the weeds. I viewed our charter as really trying to explain what the range of options are, and explain, what a CAP model does, what a CAP model doesn't do. And, it seems like we could frame this kind of information in, here's their strengths, here's their limitations, and maybe we don't have to take an official position on them. We just make sure that the readers of the document understand what they get by exploring what a CAP model might do. And we don't have to come to an agreement on whether that is the best alternative, the best route moving forward. The job is much more about how to, characterize the range of options that are out there and what benefits they bring, and where their limitations are.
Robert Marshall?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. The first thing is that I agree with Yana wholeheartedly on, I've always thought that the purpose of this group was to show the different kinds of models and discuss pros and cons and what they do and what they don't do and all of that kind of thing, because that's what's useful to the people who are going to use these models. I'm a little I'm trying to put this as delicately as I can, but I'm a little perturbed at the implication that Esteban has made about how we never discussed this, how, you know, all that kind of stuff. And it kind of feels like it's just trying to derail it to me, because I think it is absolutely relevant that there is a discussion of the fact that the model can do this. Now, whether or not it's worded appropriately, that's that's a different discussion, and I think it's a discussion worth having. That said, though, just as an example, we use risk modeling in my end of the world, right? And where it comes in is when we submit for a grant, whether it's a mitigation grant, a post-disaster mitigation grant, pre-mitigation grant, any kind of a grant through the federal government, one of the things that we have to consider is the financial impact. And it has nothing to do with insurance. It has to do with how we calculate it. One of the mandatory fields when we do any sort of fire reporting in the National Fire Incident Reporting System is a damage estimate. We all have different ways of doing damage estimates. The way that I do it, for example, is to use the reconstruction costs as put out by the International Code Council, which is something that they use for generating fees for permits, right? And it's not anywhere near accurate, but it is a standardized way of doing it so that when we are doing our grant applications, the grant applications then are comparing apples to apples when we apply this year versus next year versus the following year. That's how we do it. I think knowing that there are models out there that take those same things into consideration, and we can control the inputs or the outputs, or not control the outputs, but we can control the inputs so that we're making apples to apples comparisons, is absolutely relevant. And I think just saying, no, it shouldn't be included and it's outside of the scope, I think is a ludicrous idea. This group is supposed to be pointing out all of the different kinds of models and how all of the models work. So if the concern is that DOI doesn't want there to be anything that can be perceived as being used against the insurance industry, totally understand that. And I agree that that is outside of the scope of what we're trying to do. But I think we can write things in a way that it is understood that that wasn't our intent, that our intent is to show you, here's your model, here's what the model will do, here's what the model won't do, nothing more, nothing less. So again, I'm a little concerned with how that was presented by you, Esteban. And I don't know if you meant it that way or not, but it felt kind of insulting because I think we have talked about this the whole time. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. And to clarify, I just want to have the correct perspective. I think to move this discussion along, we should be looking at specific sections so that we can see, like, again, I haven't reviewed this final document. I haven't reviewed the final revisions. My understanding is that during the past iteration, this document did do exactly what you mentioned, Robert, that it did reintroduce as examples of CAT models, what they do, that background information. From my understanding, that was supposed to have been introduced. As that is, I agree that that is part of what has been discussed lately, of including it in the background and saying and providing information. So I thought this was has happened. What I don't understand, and I guess maybe we do just need to look at what specific is the controversy, what areas are exactly being debated about, because it seems like that if that has been satisfied, if CAT models has already been provided in the background and everything, it seems like whatever is in discussion seems to be putting it beyond that, which I'm not sure where it's going. And I would like for everybody to please take notice of Max's comments in the chat, which I think reflects what we have discussed and what I think CDI has been aligning with. And I will read his comments quickly. We can talk about risk reduction in terms of probability of home loss. The outputs of models can be expected, the number of home lost, And then each mitigation activity, whether reducing the hazard or the vulnerability in terms of reduced expected numbers of homes lost. I'm just reading those comments there. Again, I think to move this conversation and make this very fruitful, maybe we can go to exact sections that are in contention so that, like I said, I didn't edit this document. I haven't had access to this document. Only Deborah has. CDI has only been limited to Deborah having this access to this document. So I don't know where the areas of contentions are. Exactly. I know in general, but not the exact language.
Well, let me clarify that. And if you look at the Google Doc that was shared, I think there's a good summary of this on page 40, comment from June 26th, and it says, because CAP models are out of scope, I strongly suggest deleting this barrier entirely. This was a section 8.4, concerns regarding catastrophe models. The premise of this barrier and the discussion within will be taken up on July 13th at a public hearing hosted by CDI. These issues and concerns are being addressed, but I do not think this report is the place to delve into them. And then there's a discussion, which I think we all agree with, which is regulatory requirements and governing law, which is CDI's scope is outside. But the element that I think needs to be resolved fundamentally, and Esteban, it sounds like from what you've said, you may not be in a position to speak to this definitively, is whether or not CAP models are in scope or out of scope. And the comments that have been made and the suggested deletions lean towards CAP models should not be mentioned or discussed in this report, period. And that's the part where I think if we can achieve some resolution around, the other elements will be much easier to resolve, but there is an underlying tension about whether any discussion of CAP models or any explanation of how CAP models work, short of a recommendation, that's beyond the scope of this work group to say this is as I understand it, this work group is not formed to say, here's a list of models that are out there, and this is the one that should be used. I hope I speak for everyone to say that is beyond what we are formed to do and certainly what I would be comfortable doing. And that the port of this work group and the takeaway from this report ought to be, here is a discussion of the various models, the various ways models are used, from which decision makers or other work groups or other task forces could then build upon that work. And at some point, someone with the appropriate authority and mandate could pivot from there to, and this is what is going to be used for whatever the setting they were charged with resolving. I see that the actual recommendation to implement and or implementation is significantly beyond our scope. And I think, I believe there's consensus around that. Jim McDougall had his hand up next, and then Robert, we'll get back to you in just a moment.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and great discussion. And I think, to me, the point is, it's describing those models and what they can and can't do. I think just to add to this and what Robert mentioned, there has to be a way, and we don't necessarily have to say which one to use, but we do know that CAP models can help you point to which mitigations are the most cost effective based off a community. So, let's just say, for example, there's a community that's Chapter 7A compliant in roofing and maybe siding, but maybe not windows or certain things. And because of the way 7A was implemented, there are things specifically like fire and ember resistant vents that were not part of Chapter 7A previously. So if you're doing using a model to look at numerous communities across the state and identifying which ones maybe just, for example, need vents because they're compliant in everywhere else, there's a bigger cost benefit to spending the money there versus spending it where we need to replace every roof on a home in a community. So I think just pointing out that models can provide you where to do the mitigations and which ones are cost benefit and financially beneficial to reduce the risk. And then, of course, you have to know the value of the community, which I don't think is a big deal, are very, very beneficial. And part of what I feel we're charged to do is provide insight that those tools, again, can be used. So I think it gets back to a lot of the conversation. And when we describe the models that are available, we be very descriptive about what they can be used for and what they can't be used for, so people understand that better. And I'll turn my time back over. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Nancy, you have your hand up?
Sure. Yeah, I just put a link. I understand, and certainly was not attempting to be disingenuous about how CAP models work. The thing is, they do make an estimate of structural damage, and then they put a cost associated with that. The thing is, they do that for thousands and thousands of different events, and I'm not sure that they capture the structural damage and then aggregate it up in any kind of systematic way. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I mean, I'd have to look at how any individual model works to know if they typically can aggregate structures, and how you would normalize that. It's just to use these models, you don't just take output from one event one time. You model lots of fires thousands and thousands of times. So I know that that works for dollars, and I've given you a link in the chat of a report that was done by the NAIC, National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and it's not about pricing. It's about how you use models to measure mitigation benefits to a community. And that's, we put this in the paper as an illustration of how models can be used to measure mitigation. And then it was stricken because a CAP model is used, but it's clearly not a paper about pricing. It's got dollars in it, and it's got cost benefit analysis in it, and it's got lots and lots of great scientific information in it. These are supposed to be informative studies, not prescriptive, and they really don't have anything to do with what the CDI is discussing on July 13th, which is whether insurance companies should use catastrophe models for the wildfire catastrophe portion of their total premium for a prospective rate making calculation. I mean, I would know if we'd written anything about that in this paper, and we didn't write anything about that in this paper. The CDI does allow catastrophe models right now for measuring risk classification, which, if we're talking about a mitigation credit table, that is typically what you'd use a catastrophe model for. I'm still trying to stay away from that in terms of the text that we're putting in here, because I agree that this isn't focused on insurance, it's focused on mitigation. So I feel very concerned that we're getting derailed by an insurance issue that really can be left off to the side, and hollowing out the purpose of this group and what we all worked on, what we talked about, what we voted on in our outlines. I guess I still don't understand what's the threat of having this information in here, and why a cost benefit analysis that has dollars in it has to be worked around. It does not make sense to me.
And Robert, Marshall?
Yeah, actually, so a question for you, Nancy, based on what you just said. If I understood you right, what you're saying is that when the CAP model estimates costs, they're doing it kind of on a macro perspective, not on an individual structure by structure method. In other words, they're not saying, well, this house in this particular area is worth this much, and this is what we estimate the damage to be. They look at kind of the aggregate of all of the worth of a particular area and say, you know, based on the estimates, the damage could be in this percentage range. That is a percentage of this total assessed value, for example. And that's what it is, rather than saying, well, you know, this house has 7A compliance, and so it's less likely to be damaged. So this individual structure is only 15% damaged, where this one doesn't have any mitigations whatsoever. So it's you know, it's this amount of damage. It's
Not
more
quite.
of a,
Not
right?
quite. They do the estimates on a house by house basis typically, but then when they aggregate across event by event, I believe what gets aggregated would just be dollars. So I don't think you'd have in an average year 4% of this house is damaged. It's not that way. It's like in one event 0 damage, in one event another event 50% damage, in another event 100% damage. And what are the dollars associated with it? What's the probability? And that's what gets aggregated. So these are, when we're talking about cap models, we're talking about probabilistic simulation models. I don't know that the structural stuff gets probabilized and simulated and then aggregated. So the output of the model, which is typically not the detailed level stuff, which is part of the calculations. I just don't think it's part of the model output. Is one structure, like how many times did it get damaged and what were the probabilities of each one and what was the percentage of each one. I know that the dollars goes out that way. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit technical, but it actually has to do with whether the model could be used or could not be used. And I think the answer is probably not.
Got it. So, I mean, based on that, it sounds like what we're trying to, I guess, come to consensus over is whether or not CDI has a problem with this. And that seems to me to be the completely wrong approach. I mean, unless CDI can enumerate exactly why this model shouldn't be included, I don't know. I guess I feel like it was just a waste of time to even undertake any of this because of, you know, if we're going to allow that to derail the entire conversation, it seems like it was a pointless exercise to begin with. So I share Nancy's concern that I think we're going down a rabbit hole for a single agency issue. And I think that very definitely is not the intent of the work group, to protect a state agency. I just don't see that as being valid, I guess.
So I call on Esteban, and then what I'd like to do next is we'll take a vote, basically to determine within the broader construct of cap models included with caveats, cap models not included. Then we have some other comments and some things to review. But Esteban, floor is yours.
Yes, I just want to have clarity. Is the only issue section 8.4, and I just want to, like, again, because I haven't had access to this document, can someone just confirm that, in fact, the background section explaining the different models and all of that, is that includes CLAP models and that's not an issue? Can somebody, before I go on, can somebody just confirm that that's the case?
Now, the example in 8.4 is just illustrative. There were 3, maybe 4 specific comments with the same language. I included a couple of them in the chat. So there's the discussion that, or what I would like to distill this down to a vote on, is whether or not it's appropriate to include cat risk models short of the discussion of how they could then be used for rate setting and regulation, which I believe we're all in consensus is outside the group. So the specific question is whether or not cat risk models are appropriate to include in this report on wildfire modeling, and if so, then there are multiple instances in the report where that would resolve discussions about whether things that were originally included and been recommended for deletion would come in or drop out.
And I guess before I pass on the floor to somebody else, I do think we do need to take an action and move on. I'm wondering if one potential solution to all of this is to put somewhere in the introduction or somewhere in the beginning of this document just that clarification, like statement that none of this report is intended to be any sort of assessment or things on insurance regulation, insurance pricing, etc. Maybe a statement, a disclaimer to that extent can help move the needle along. Again, I don't think I know in prior versions there was explicit comments in explicit language in the report, specifically mentioning CDI and mentioning regulations and mentioning insurance pricing. I think all of that has been removed. So, we're not trying to derail anything. Given that the initial draft was repleted with areas explicitly mentioning insurance regulation, I think that just raised, the looking at the document to make sure it's within its lane. But we are not trying to derail it. We're just trying to make sure it is within its scope. So hopefully those things can be considered. Thank you.
And so, having been involved in the editing, those references that were initially included, which were part nested within broader things, those have been deleted by consensus quite some time ago. And I don't believe the current version strays into that lane at all. I'd refer to the broader group about discussion about a disclaimer up front. From my perspective, that actually feels more problematic in some areas, especially if the report is silent on those things. But we'll resolve that in a moment. I don't know whoever your hand up is. I'm not sure who that is. It looks like ILO.
It is, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to speak right now because I'm a public person. I was just wondering if I could give feedback after being in many of these meetings watching you guys before you have your vote on the CAT models.
Yeah, let me ask Celeste. I don't know either. Celeste, is this an appropriate time for public comment, or should we press forward with the internal deliberation about interop?
Per Bagley-Keene, members of the public can comment after a discussion item. We just ask that they limit their time, so to keep to keep it moving. But if the public wants to go ahead and comment, they are allowed to do so.
Okay, this seemed like a great time.
Thank you so very much. My name is Ilo. I live in Felton, California. And as the fire risks escalate in California, there's a high need for risk and mitigation models. CAT models is what people are coming up with, and they've been developed for that very purpose. We need to have more uniformity and standardization, the very purpose of the models, to help us all be on the same page, from CAL FIRE to communities to homeowners. It seems like CDI is trying to determine how the document is written for their purposes only, derailing what is outside of the insurance's own lane of insurance pricing. Please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We lose a lot of fire mitigation benefit by rejecting the CAT models. Legislators, grant applications, community planning, homeowner planning, all use financial risk and cost benefits to make decisions. And this includes motivating the communities and individuals for active fire prevention and mitigation. So I'm requesting that as you vote, you consider leaving the CAT models in the document for all of these other purposes. We need to motivate people to be fire safe, and this is one way to do it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like we're closer to consensus than we were, but I would like to take a vote just to ensure that we are speaking with consensus. So I would frame the question as whether or not there are residual concerns from members of the working group within the inclusion of a discussion of the mechanics of how CAT risk models work and what essentially a description of what they do, less advocacy about whether or not it would be appropriate to use them within insurance rate setting or regulation, which I believe, speaking for the group, is uniformly recognized as being outside of our scope and in CDI's lane. If we could start with using the hands, the raising of hands, please. If you,
hey, Dave, before we get there, a point of order question.
Please.
Yeah.
So is Esteban, are you fully able to make that vote, or do we need to have because what I'm concerned about is your Deborah, right, is the one who wrote the comment. And what I don't want to do is have a vote now and then have her come back later and say, no, that's not what I meant at all. And I disagree with the vote that you made. And now we have to revisit the topic. So are you fully authorized to make that kind of a vote, or is it going to come back on us later?
So let me clarify.
No, I understand the question. I think this is supposed to be a group vote, so I don't think, and Celeste, maybe you can let us know in the rule. I mean, I don't think, in terms of a group vote, I don't think CDI has a veto power. So I think in terms of specific sections, I think if the group votes a certain way, then that's the way I mean, as far as I understand, the vote is it's just supposed to be what the group votes. I don't believe CDI has veto power outside of specific areas, like that's out of scope. But so if the specific group, Celeste, can you perhaps let us know about what's the voting, if it's unanimous, majority, etc.?
I'm
This
looking
is
that up
Jim McDougall.
right now. Go
Celeste, I'll
ahead,
do
Jim.
it. It's a
Thank you.
majority vote. And so the first thing we'll need is a motion to include CAP models into the document.
Okay, I'll move.
Okay, so
Nancy, I think you're trying
I'll
to talk,
second.
but you're muted.
I was waiting till you guys finished discussing procedure. Are you waiting for a motion, or do you want to keep talking about?
Yes.
Procedure?
Is there a motion to add CAP models or continue to have CAP models in the report?
Nancy Watkins, so moved.
And Chris
Is there
Ochoa
Robert-
seconds.
Perfect.
Chris Ochoa, a second?
Yes.
Okay, let's use the raise your hands because we just want to make sure. So all those in favor of keeping and including CAT risk models in the written document, signify by raising your hand on the chat, on the hand tool.
Okay, everyone, just keep them raised. This is Celeste. Just keep them raised for a minute, okay? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, take your hands down, please. All those opposed, please raise your hand.
I'm trying to take mine off, so I
You're
voted
trying to
for.
take your spot.
Yeah, sorry.
That's fine.
Not letting me.
And I
Just
just want
hit
to
raise
clarify
again,
for the
yeah.
record that if CDI is abstaining, I'm abstaining because the question is not that catastrophic should not be mentioned at all. It's rather how they're being used in the report. Again, CDI has always said that the background, it's fine. So we don't have a problem with the background information.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any opposed. One abstention from Esteban. So motion passes unanimously. Dave, I'll turn it back over to you to grab the next topic for discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Celeste, if you could scroll up to page 3, where it begins section 1.1, risk versus hazard. It's okay, excellent. So this is just for background, for everyone's awareness. Melissa recommended and Deborah inserted using numbers to break out the sections. I think that really helps with the flow, and presume that's non-controversial. If we could come down to the next section, which is on page 5 and 6, where there previously were significant and extended quote from the USDA website. This has been modified. If you could scroll down just a little bit more. Great. So this has been modified so that what we did is we took out the quote and we inserted a summary. I believe this faithfully represents what was previously in the quote, and it maps what is on the USDA website. I think it's a useful discussion of terms that are relevant. The only element that is added, and it's added down below underneath the, scroll down again a little bit more, please. Underneath the diagram of hazard, risk, vulnerability. There we go. Great. There's a discussion here that I added that is not included in the wildfire on the USDA website, but I think is relevant, which is the speed with which fire moves. Intensity is, from my perspective, is largely a Forest Service thing about protecting commercially valuable timber, whereas speed is relevant to our discussion of structure loss, and it's the relative speed of how fast the fire is moving relative to the firefighting response. If there are firefighters there before the fire gets there, we're unlikely to experience large scale spread. if the fire gets there before firefighters, obviously then we have lost the fight, more likely than not. So those were significant changes there. All that said, I believe the intent and the information that's conveyed is unchanged. It just came out of the form of a multi-page quote. I'll hold there for any discussion or concerns on those major changes. Yana?
I'm good with these kind of changes. I was curious about the ability to edit for clarity and items and jargon as an example. Like, are we in a place where as a committee we can do that kind of work, or is it really just in the hands of the three writers? And because I don't even know how to provide comments at this point because the document was locked.
Yana, really quick, hang on, Dave. So I opened it up completely to you guys based on your email addresses that I have. So whether that be through your work or through your city, county, or your organization. And I think people are going in and trying to use their personal Google accounts. And if I don't have them, I can't add you guys as editors to the documents. So if you are going to use your personal account, I just need that so I can put that in. And this was because we learned the first go around that if we just open it up for everybody, then we don't know who's commenting and we can't track it. So if you're going to do that, just send me an email, say this is the email I need added, and then that will make it easier. Because I don't get notified. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, from my perspective, if we've got a few folks who have who want to make changes with regard to style or how we sell the same point, much easier to solve. But we were really stuck with those being blended within some fundamental underlying questions that hadn't been resolved. So understanding that we do have a little bit of a time crunch, and I defer to Jim McDougall, but I personally would have no issue if we unlock it and open it up for some moving of things around for flow and so forth, or changing a language for flow, as long as we're leaving the broad themes or what we're agreeing upon here. And it was really confusing when we were trying to do both at once, resolve a major issue and move commas around.
Right. So it's today more about let's make sure we get the right themes here, and then maybe our next round is around how to smooth, stylize, clarity, edits, etc.
Yeah, that's how I approach it. But Jim, you have your hand up. I defer to you as the lead.
Yeah, Dave, I agree there. And then I had one comment, and maybe I just missed it when I reviewed it. I thought susceptibility got left out of this, and I believe it in this section, just as it was being edited. Did I look at that incorrectly?
Yeah, it's in there, Jim, under vulnerability, exposure, plus susceptibility to wildfire at the bottom of page 6. If you could scroll up just a little, Celeste, please. And it's in there as that last bullet.
Okay. Thank you. I thought I just missed it. I think it's different because their bullets were before they were bigger bullets, but we can clean that up later. Never mind. Thank you.
All right, Anthony.
Hi. I apologize for not being on the last couple meetings, but I have been following your guys' edits, and I think that the report has come a long way. In specific to this section, when you're talking about rates of spread and things like that, I think just a general overview is good. This isn't designed to be a fire behavior class, but as long as they understand and it's in the individuals that are exposed to this can grasp the concept of the terminology, then it brings them into the world of and this isn't, wildfire spread, rates of spread, things like that. Like, again, we're not trying to create a document that is going to train everybody to make fire behavior predictions. That's the professional series. And as a representative for CPF, we need to keep that line so that people aren't starting to think that they are the professionals, right? Within their own lane. So I think a general overview is adequate and suffice.
So you're saying, Anthony, just make sure I got it right. Like, when we get into the kilowatts per meter and explanation of chains, that just hold fast on spread rates and not get into what constitutes a spread rate and what are the specific outputs?
Yeah.
I mean, what I did when I wrote this section, what I tried to do was take the relevant elements really of S390 and 490, that not of how you calculate an ellipse and not how you none of that, but so that the outputs are understood, because I do think we struggle with folks not knowing the difference between intensity and spread rates and how that matter, and that we often, the end user is just looking at a color coded map and they don't know what goes into that color coded map. And that's how we end up with hazard maps being used as risk, because folks don't know the difference. And so from my perspective, I thought there was some value in dropping in a little bit of the background to set the stage for why fire line intensity, spread rates are two different, and flame length really are different things and have different outputs, and those different outputs are relevant to the firefighting functions that CPF members will be carrying out. And without understanding those differences, I think it's hard to understand the role firefighters play in disrupting the path the fire takes into a community. And that we need to understand that, unlike a hazard map, which is a discussion of landscape level things for land use planning, a risk map is going to be highly variable, both to mitigations and to response.
Right, because all we can do is put out, so for the modeling purpose of risk, it's on a probability case, right? And under certain conditions, a tiered out risk model where they can put a CAP model, say worst case scenario, through normal conditions, and have that be able to be fluid during different times of the year when we're in red flag warnings and stuff like that. It's like, well, if you guys, these models, it's not a guarantee, right? There's no guarantee to say that if you do all of these things to your house, that your house will be saved from fire. But what it does do is it lowers the risk, right? And so that's what we're trying to do. The hazards are always going to be changing, right? Especially if they're staying up on their modifications and they're making the retrofits to home hardening and all these things. So a tiered approach for these insurance companies is, and I know that there's a very lengthy discussion prior to this one on, where does that lie? That's I agree to some respect, that's not in our lane, but that's for those agencies to really to hit the ground and do some ground pounding on, like, okay, where can they tier these things down to fix and solve that problem? We're just trying to give them the tools to figure it out, right? At least that's how I've been looking at this. The fire behavior side of all of this, if you're in the world of firefighting and you've been doing it a while, you know that it's cyclic, and we've been through a very extreme case of unprecedented fire behavior. But then look at our year so far this year. If you look at fire history, we were burning like crazy over the past couple of years, and we had a very wet winter, and so it's gonna happen. We're gonna have these slower starts. Fire season's coming. It's for a fire year. It's gonna pick up eventually, but are we gonna see what we've seen in the past couple of years, right? And we won't know that until it happens. Our capabilities as a firefighting unit, the state of California, the amount of resources that we have, absolutely. If we can engage that fire and suppress it accordingly, that's our job. That's what we do aggressively, as aggressively as we can, right? But on the other spectrum of that, it's Mother Nature, and sometimes you could put 1 million firefighters in front of something, and we're not going to win that fight. It's a part of our fire culture and this regime, right? So as long as we can have I think what you guys did is appropriate to sum that up. I think it was very well written. If there's people that want to start getting into the nitty gritty of fire behavior, there's classes they can take and do that. And I would actually recommend that some of these other agencies look into doing that and understanding it more. This is like a glimpse into what it is and the terminology to share, so that they understand how we calculate those things and why firefighters are able to put people where they're supposed to be to do the best job that they can.
Understood. Appreciate it. Deborah, could we roll down to top of page 10? There's Yana, I think this might be your diagram. There we go. There. So on this one, there was a discussion that this should be titled Mitigating Wildfire Risk, not Modeling Fire Risk for this diagram. If there's any, Yana, is this yours?
Yeah, and it was really just a thought exercise that we had one day, and we never really had a chance to talk about it. Happy to edit it. I just needed to get editorial approval because I couldn't get in. So easy to change.
Yeah, that would
And
be
I guess
great.
the really big question is, does this get at the questions that we were trying to answer, and does it help the reader, digest this, the ways that we can bring in intervention strategies?
Oh, if if there's 1,000% button, I push that one right now. Yeah, this is fundamental to the discussion, which I think is relevant to this discussion, is relevant to fire safety, which is parcel level mitigations are one tiny piece of the broader network effect of how fire will spread through a neighborhood and through a community. And a number of parcels will make up the neighborhood and will make up the community, and risk is intrinsically linked to the conditions on those parcels and the aggregation of those parcels into something larger. So from my perspective, this diagram is tremendously helpful. I've actually used it in a few places trying to talk people on to, no, look, this isn't just a parcel level. This is a network effect. And I think this, especially with the title change to mitigating, I think this is a tremendously valuable diagram.
Okay. Well, if anybody has, I'm happy to tweak the words that are in there, some of the examples. It's easy to fix. So.
Wonderful, thank you. And then if we could come down to Melissa, your comment on the bottom of page 10 on the same page. I'll give it to you for the discussion with the broader group.
Yeah, so I added a couple of references in this document that it had to get a little bit further along before I felt like I could find the appropriate places to call them out. But I wanted to, to make sure that we call out the fact that it's not just the structure itself being mitigated. It's also, there's elements of what the utility does that surrounds those structures that's going to be incredibly important as well, and will impact, the ultimate effects of any mitigations that happen. So apologies, a lot of people just arrived. So this is one place I started to put just a sentence in to call this out. I recognize this is new to the group in terms of bringing this in, these little elements. So if there's a problem, I'm happy to talk it through. If there's a better way to word it, I'm happy to talk it through. But just, wanted to call out, since I was one of the 3 people editing, that I did take some liberties to add these in while I was in there, but they're all open for discussion.
And if I could just add perhaps as a concern I have, and this is for the group's discussion, proximity to utilities or proximity to anything really. From my perspective, the ignition side of this is very different than the conditions on the ground that will or will not support wildfire spread. And so back to Austin's point a minute ago about the variability and the seasonal nature of the weather, and that ultimately the risk is a combination of a bunch of external factors, of which ignition is only one. And at least from my personal opinion, probably one of the least important, because ignition reduction is not going to change the fact that this is a fire-prone and fire-dependent landscape in which we live. And so reducing a specific source of ignition, from my perspective, is not particularly relevant to the risk a community is exposed to. But I'd be very interested in the broader group's discussion about the relevance of ignition reduction and specific ignition reduction around utilities, how that lends to its broader discussion of risk modeling.
So perhaps this is a great conversation to have. Perhaps I can just provide a little more context of my thinking. Is obviously, utility caused wildfires have been some of the largest that we've had, some of the most catastrophic that we've had over the last number of years. And there's obviously been a lot of effort on the part of the state to try to reduce ignitions from utilities because of the oversized impact they have, despite being a small percentage of the wildfires that are caused in the state. They have an outsized impact. So I'm open to how things get characterized. Again, maybe it doesn't go right here. It doesn't go in this way, but I think we'd be remiss to minimize the role of reducing ignitions, especially when these types of ignitions can have such a catastrophic impact.
Now, Dave, it seems like just the whole discussion about where ignitions occur, and maybe clarifying again that that's, I hear your point that you're saying here. But we're deep in the weeds and our readers may not get that information. So it could be helpful to try and clarify, there's a whole range from, proximity to roadways to, other sources of anthropogenic ignitions that put communities in different conditions. I mean, there's a whole, sort of landscape context that is not reflected in the graphic that I identified there, because that was really much more specific to the home and built environment. But it seems like we could scale up a little bit and talk about that context.
Okay, yeah. So Yana, you be the first to concede. You know more about this part of the topic than I do. That I agree with the context as it relates to slope and exposure and surrounding fuels. Right, I've always thought that was a weird area that was poorly understood or poorly incorporated, and ought to be. Right, where a structure or a parcel is located matters. The source of ignition, to me, it's a lot less clear that because if to Melissa's point, if there are successful efforts to reduce utility caused ignitions, which is a good thing, but it's unclear to me that is not going to be supplanted by other sources of ignition, and that if excluding one is not going to exclude the other, and as long as there are humans and lightning and all of the other things that cause fires, they're going to continue to be fires. There were fires before there was utility infrastructure. There will probably be fires after utility infrastructure has been removed from the ignition problem.
It's a tough one, I would say, because it has been an effective mitigating tool when the utility companies start browning out their power lines to communities in those red flag warnings. You can look at some of the major incidents that have happened in the past couple of years, and it's worked. You look at the Woolsey fire, you look at there's been so many, and so they're doing their own mitigation process and putting their own measures in place. They're actually putting together their own fire crews to go out and do their weed abatements and things like that from faulty lines. Again, that's something that they've taken on because they understand their own risk and their own liability when these incidents happen, and someone's got to pay for it, right? So I think they're going to do what they need to do to mitigate their own liabilities, if that makes sense. The 100 feet with, and that's what it's been, right? It's been 100 feet. And I remember back to an earlier conversation where I think Nancy was talking about like better is better. That I think the goal here is that we're trying to get to these homeowners, get to these communities, and have them take some of their own exposure and liability into their own hands, because at the end of the day, the insurance companies their premiums are going through the roof if they live in that wildland urban interface. And I think that this is going to help them, get back to where it should be, provided that they're able to do the things that are being recommended. Thought that was the mission.
All right, Melissa.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, some of this may also, just to be upfront, some of the lack of this may be a product of the fact that I was on a leave of absence for 3 months. And so there was, I had representatives in my place. So apologies if this is coming in a little late, but I think the only point I was trying to make with this is that, let's take a step back. I mean, we've as a state decided that this is an incredibly important issue. We have, as a state, on the ratepayers, invested $30 billion in the last 3 years to try to reduce utility cost wildfires. So the only point that I was trying to make, and again, where to put it, how to put it, where the appropriate place to put it, I'm open to. But the only thing I think that's just important to recognize is that if you are a homeowner and you are surrounded by high risk utility assets, the utilities have all of their own consequence and risk modeling and everything, and that's where we're pushing them, right? If you are surrounded by what is designated as a high-risk utility asset that has not been hardened. There, you can do a lot to mitigate, I guess, if the fire does start. Maybe Dave, that's your point. If the fire does start, you can do things to try to help your own house, but there's some mitigations. I'm talking this through live, and now I'm starting to see your point more. So, I guess I was trying to say to make a point that there's more mitigations beyond just your own individual house, the mitigation you make on your own home that could impact the likelihood of the ignition, which I guess, Dave, was your point, right? Is that okay?
From my point, it is a statement of fact that there will be fires in California.
Yeah, of course.
And that the natural state for California includes fire. And if we reduce a source of ignition, there will be other ignitions, and fire will burn across the landscape inevitably for both natural and anthropogenic reasons, having to do with the cause. But the mitigations at both the parcel, the neighborhood, and the community level are agnostic of the source of ignition. And so if reducing ignitions is good, it's not a bad thing.
Got it. Okay.
But I also don't think there is a fire-free future is not a good thing for California. I also think it's unrealistic.
No, I understand. Okay. I think I see your point. So then perhaps this should just be removed.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think that you guys worked through it, but I guess my thought process was that if we wanted to have something in there about mitigations, we could add it up in the mitigations that matter section. We have other considerations in there. It just might be one of those, right? About if that's where the group wanted to add it. But I think you guys kind of talked your way through it anyway. So
yeah, maybe that's where it goes, because I created a barrier for it. But listening to Jim, to Dave, I think I was misinterpreting the way to think about this. So so perhaps it is something we just put in mitigation.
Yeah, I think it's a mitigation, not a ignition reduction, because I'm with Dave on the ignition reduction side, but we all know it's a very, very beneficial mitigation, right? So maybe we put something in the mitigation section.
Okay, I'm open to deleting this then.
It seems like we could add a piece about anthropogenic mitigation. I mean, mitigations for anthropogenic sources in the mitigations that matter, right? I mean, there's a bunch of them in there.
I think that's a good suggestion and very artful. That would be a great place for it to be. It is part of the discussion, but it would be linked under a broader discussion of mitigations. And we work on it. We work from out to in for a community and from in to out. At the same time, we prepare homes to be more adapted and resilient for fire. It would also be reasonable and prudent to take steps to reduce ignitions in sources that are reducible. Right? We can't stop lightning. We can't exclude lightning from the landscape. But we can and have been successful at doing things to reduce anthropogenic origin fires that occur on the worst possible days. And utilities certainly have had a part in that.
Great, thank you. Then this really helps me think it through. So thank you. I've been trying to figure out how to get this in here and where it's appropriate. So thank you.
Seems like a good place. Okay, Celeste, if we could go down to page 13, section 3.1. And Yana, you had some proposed changes that are shown under option A, and I'd give it to you to talk those through.
Sure. So sorry if the context didn't make sense here. What I was thinking is that the way we were framing this is part educational and in part, and I hope this doesn't sit poorly on CDI, but the idea that we're promoting the Safer from Wildfires program is one of the approaches that we're getting at, which goes into detail and gives recognition and credit for actions that can take place that individuals can manage. It seemed like there needed to be some more communication around what those actions are, how they fit in context, and how to explain what they are capable of addressing. I think there's lots of editing to be done between either version of this, but that was the effort that I was trying to make. And I did react a little bit to, there was some earlier language around that we should frame all the mitigations on the exterior perimeter of a community. and just tried to pull it back a little bit and talk about, that embers have such a long distance transport element associated with them that we need to talk about, there's value in hardening the exterior perimeter of a community, but there's also reason to work in the interior of the community as well. And so to put some context together for those two things. So that was the frame that I looked at within these sets of mitigations that could matter, and how to structure it respective to structure separation, which is something that we had talked about as a work group several times.
Yeah, and just for whatever it's worth, when I wrote this section, what I was trying to call out using the technical note 2205 methodology having to do with defining high density, moderate, and low density communities is really speaking to the probability of structure to structure transmission, which from my perspective becomes a game changer, because the flux generated by a burning structure overwhelms any 7A or other wildfire resistant measures, and can't be mitigated through defensible space in a way the ground component of wildland fire can be. And that was what I was really trying to call out, because I think what that sets the stage for from a modeling perspective is the density absolutely matters with regard to how you model the potential impact and how you're accounting for the firefighting response. And that, and so there's, and I think slightly off-topic conversation on the ember piece, but on the structure transmission piece, if there is enough fire to get enough structures burning that are close enough to burn other structures, right? That really Jack Cohn's stage 6, the disaster sequence in the WUI, all of that is relative to the time it will take to aggregate an effective firefighting force relative to the size of the problem you're trying to solve for. So if we have a whole bunch of dense, if we have Coffee Park, right? Once that first row of homes was established, that firefight was lost because it was now structure to structure transmission, and it was going to take an enormous weight of attack to disrupt structural transmission in a way a much lower density of firefighting resources can disrupt vegetative pathways. So that those are two fundamentally different things as we move towards conflagration. That's what I was trying to call out as far as the introducing the discussion that there is how risk is understood and then modeled will be different depending on how far the structures are eve to eve.
Right. I think we're in total agreement. I think that the distinction is that, there's a lot of active research going in right now around how to look at the structure separations and what the home hardening actions can be, and, do those mitigations begin to turn the equation in some situations. And, I think there's optimism in that space, and looking at IBHS's experiments, and, that's really, those are experiments when homes are built really more closely to 7A standards. We see pretty good outcomes there, at least in that simulated framework, in a lab setting. So I just think there's some value in talking about some of the home hardening actions that are trying to be designed to mitigate some of that when we know we get to those kind of urban situations.
Okay.
So maybe you and I can sit down and kind of look at the language together and work on that stuff side by side.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. Is it from the broader group? Are there anyone else have discussion items here? If not, Yana and I'll take this offline and we'll craft something that makes it all work. Jim?
Yeah, Dave, I think that's a great idea. And you and I discussed too, I think to Yana's point too, we ought to maybe cite some of that good research and those a little bit heavier than we did. Those studies and the research going on. I know it's tied up in the footnotes, but I think we, kind of Yana's point, we bring that out maybe just a little heavier. So.
Okay. And then Celeste, if we could come down to page 17 to Melissa's comment about consequence models. There we go. Melissa, I'll give you the floor for the discussion of consequence models.
Yeah, and this was again just a food for thought question of whether it's kind of related to just how much depth do we want to provide on the types of models that are out there. And I get that these are used by the utilities to determine consequence of ignitions that their equipment causes. So it's a little bit on the periphery, but just didn't know if we wanted to include those kinds of that kind of information in here, or if that was just two on the periphery to include. I don't have a strong feeling about it either way.
Any discussion? Robert?
Yeah, I do think that I do think that it's worth discussing it. Maybe this isn't helpful for what Melissa was saying, but I do think, maybe I would worry about getting too much into it just because I don't think it's a model that a lot of people are going to use. I think this is a model that's pretty specific in who uses it, but I think it's I think that we have to include it, because what I would hate to have happen is somebody comes to a homeowners group or a jurisdiction and they say, well, we've got this model, and they may not understand the limitations of the model as far as how it kind of integrates into the bigger picture. But I do think it's worth including in the consequence models. So.
Okay. Well, once we figure out, maybe once we figure out exactly where it should go, I can just work with, some of my folks to get a couple sentences in there. I just want to be cognizant of the fact that we're past time, so I don't know if we even have a quorum anymore. People are dropping.
Celeste, are we able to keep going, or do we have to wrap up?
I think that is up to
Yeah,
you
we
guys to
do.
decide. Do we have to wrap up?
Yeah, if it's an agendized for so long, I mean, it could go a little longer, but we can't lose a majority of the group.
I think we still have a majority of the group on.
Okay.
Well, maybe we
give me
just solve this flash push. I see Nancy had her hand up.
Nancy,
Yeah,
did you have a comment?
I was just going to say that I like that idea. Sorry, I didn't mean to go backwards. I decided to type it into the chat instead. I think people get very confused about models. And if there's a model that gets frequently cited in the wildfire space, that it's not a diversion to put in a couple of sentences about it. So anyway, sorry. You guys have already moved on, and I didn't put my hand down fast enough.
Okay. Well, noting the time then and the following participation, what I would propose, Yana, you and I will talk about the SSD section and work something there. And then Jim, deferring to you, what I propose then is I'll work to go through and clean up the comments. There's a couple that are pretty straightforward. I think we have the direction we needed on the broader question, and then we can circulate that draft for comments with the executive summary reinserted.
No, I think that's a great direction, Dave. I agree 100%. And yeah, being as that we are out of time, so let me grab the agenda here. So we have an upcoming meeting on July 19th. So Dave, as you can get those, we will of course get it posted for everybody to review. And I guess question for the group, and Dave, to you, is it better that people put their edits in the comments or actually edits in the document?
Comments, please. It becomes almost unreadable when now, like if you're moving a comma around or something just for how it reads, I don't think that needs to be a comment. But if it's substantive, comments are much better, so we understand what it is you're trying to say. And that in the absence of that, sometimes it's hard to understand the intent, and then we're left sort of waiting until we get the broader group together. So I would ask for edits if it has to do with style or flow or how it reads, no problem making a direct entry. But if it has to do whether or not something should be included or where it should be included, please limit that to a comment. It'll be just much easier to resolve that way.
Okay.
I have a question. All those deletions that got made, and the executive summary that got deleted, I did a round of edits and didn't try to put them in because there was so much deleted. Is there a way to restore that before we go back in and try to re-edit things?
Yes, and that, from my perspective, what we were waiting on resolution was the discussion of the essentially limited inclusion of CAP models, which I believe we've resolved. That'll drive the vast majority of the substantive either deletions and then what I think was correct, which was hiding the exec summary, that until we resolved the underlying question, we were just chasing our tail. What I endeavor to do here is to reinsert those so that we have a document that represents the output of today, the discussion today, and that from there we can all shoot on that target rather than solve the version control issue that way.
And do we have dates when everybody needs to do whatever they're doing?
Jim or Celeste, if we're meeting on the 19th, when do we have, what are our publication timelines?
Yes, we do have dates. Let me pull up your document here that has that information. Give me just a second here.
I was trying to put comments into the section, and mainly this was for you, Nancy, and it was just, I felt like I was messing it up, and so I just stopped because it was like there was like a trail, and the wording it wasn't like syncing well to the Teams doc, and so I just ended up printing it out, and I have some hand jotted notes that I'll share with you at some point, Nancy, for what I was thinking. But to be honest, I really like what the majority group has put together. I think it looks awesome. You guys, good work.
Thank you.
I need the edits back from everyone by the 14th, so 7/14, close of business. That gives me time to upload it into the Google Docs for everyone to go in and review. If your, as Jan and I figured out, if your email that I have currently does not allow for edits, then I'm going to need you to email me the email that you will use to make edits to the Google Doc so I can put you in there as an editor. And so you can actually make edits to the Google Doc or add the comments as Dave is requesting for people to make comments that way, because some organizations do allow for Google edits and some don't with your email. So please email me if you are having an issue so I can resolve them. Because again, that Google section, that Google Doc that we're using is all of Fire Marshal's Google sort of drive. And so everyone's using it. So just as an FYI for you, so I don't get notifications for it and I don't check it. So just send me an email and I can resolve that issue for you quickly.
Okay, and do we need a motion to adjourn, Celeste?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Oh,
Okay, it's been moved, I think, by Dave, right? And seconded by
Correct.
Anthony. Okay,
Yes.
for adjourn. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, aye for adjournment.
Bye.
I
Any abstentions? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we got a long ways today. Thank you, Dave. Sorry for my hippie signal. Great job, though. And get those comments back and we'll get them out to the group. Thanks,
Dave,
everyone.
Dave, can you stay on for just a quick second, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Super.
I just wanted to ask Dave, how do you want me to handle this? Do you want me to upload this new document that I made a few edits on within the comments?
Yes,
And
please.
You want to just do it that way and you can just go in and
Yeah.
grab it?
Yes, please. If you could do that to the Google Drive or replace the one that's in the Google Drive, and I'll work from there. And that way I'm standing on the